10 Japanese fighters circled above the Pacific, their radios crackling with confusion. Somewhere below, an American pilot on his very first combat mission had just disappeared into a cloud bank after scattering their formation. They had seen him dive. They had seen him climb. They had watched him twist through their crossfire like a man who had done this 1,000 times. But he was a rookie, a replacement pilot with fewer than 50 hours in his new aircraft. The voices on those frequencies asked the same question. Where did he go? The answer would change everything the Imperial Navy thought they knew about the war they were losing. The Central Pacific in late 1943 was a killing ground measured in nautical miles and aircraft attrition rates. American carriers pushed westward in an island-hopping campaign that demanded air superiority over waters the Japanese had controlled since Pearl Harbor. Every lagoon, every coral strip, every volcanic outcrop represented another layer of defense that had to be peeled away before the next advance could begin. The distances were staggering. The logistics were unprecedented, and the men who flew from those pitching flight decks knew that survival depended on factors beyond their control. The weather that autumn shifted between tropical clarity and sudden squalls that could swallow entire task forces. Pilots launched into mornings so bright the sea burned white beneath them, only to return through rain so heavy their instruments became useless. The humidity clung to everything. It corroded electrical connections, warped wooden components, and left men drenched in sweat before they even reached their aircraft. The Pacific Theater offered no gentle introductions. It simply consumed whoever arrived and sorted the survivors from the statistics. Carrier aviation had evolved rapidly since the early disasters of 1942. The desperate fights at Coral Sea and Midway had proven that naval air power would decide the war's outcome, but they had also revealed the brutal mathematics of attrition. American industry was producing aircraft and pilots at rates the Japanese could not match. Yet each replacement who arrived on a carrier deck represented months of training that could be erased in a single unlucky encounter. The veterans who greeted these new arrivals understood something the training schools could never teach. Combat was not about skill alone. It was about the aircraft you flew, the enemy you faced, and the narrow margin between learning fast and dying young. By autumn 1943, the Navy had begun deploying a fighter that promised to shift those margins. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had entered service earlier that year, and the men who flew it spoke of the aircraft with something approaching reverence. It was not the fastest fighter in the Pacific. It was not the most maneuverable. But it was the first American carrier fighter that could meet the Japanese Zero on equal terms and survive the encounter through a combination of speed, firepower, and structural integrity that its predecessors had lacked. The Hellcat emerged from lessons written in blood. Grumman engineers had studied captured Zeros, interviewed surviving pilots, and designed an aircraft specifically to counter Japanese strengths while exploiting their weaknesses. The result was a machine that weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero, but could absorb punishment that would have shattered the lighter Japanese fighter. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, giving it climb rates and high-altitude performance that erased the Zero's traditional advantages. 6. 50-caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower at ranges where Japanese weapons remained ineffective, but an aircraft was only as capable as the man in its cockpit. And in late 1943, most of those cockpits held pilots who had never fired their guns in anger. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. The pilot who would vanish into that cloud bank grew up in a landscape nothing like the Pacific. The flat farmlands of the American Midwest produced young men accustomed to machinery, to open horizons, and to the particular patience required for work that depended on weather and timing. He was typical of his generation in ways that mattered. He had graduated high school knowing the Depression's weight. He had watched newsreels of distant wars with the detachment of someone who assumed oceans would keep such horrors far away. And he had enlisted after Pearl Harbor with the same mixture of anger and duty that filled recruiting stations across the country. Naval aviation selection was brutal in its efficiency. The program sought young men with specific combinations of reflexes, spatial awareness, and psychological stability that no examination could fully predict. Thousands washed out during preliminary training. Thousands more discovered they could fly well enough to earn wings, but lacked some indefinable quality that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. The system sorted ruthlessly because carrier operations demanded perfection. There were no emergency fields in the middle of the ocean. There were no second chances when an arresting wire snapped or a wave caught a descending aircraft. He had proven adequate in primary training. His instructors noted steady hands and good instrument discipline. He followed procedures precisely, rarely improvised, and demonstrated the kind of mechanical sympathy that suggested he understood aircraft as systems rather than simply vehicles. These were not qualities that produced aces. They were qualities that produced survivors. And in the calculus of carrier aviation, survivors mattered more than headlines. Advanced training introduced him to fighter tactics developed from the hard experience of 1942. He learned the thatch weave, the defensive maneuver that had allowed American pilots to survive against more maneuverable opponents by working in coordinated pairs rather than individual combat. He practiced division tactics, section integrity, and the fundamental principle that had emerged from every engagement with Japanese fighters. Never try to outturn a Zero. Use speed, use altitude, use the structural strength of American aircraft to survive maneuvers that would tear Japanese fighters apart. These lessons existed in training manuals and briefing rooms. They made perfect sense when diagrammed on chalkboards or discussed over coffee in ready rooms. But no amount of instruction could prepare a pilot for the reality of combat. The speed, the disorientation, the simultaneous need to track multiple aircraft while managing fuel, ammunition, engine temperature, and the constant threat of anti-aircraft fire. Veterans described aerial combat as hours of boredom punctuated by minutes of terror so compressed that memory could barely contain them afterward. He received his assignment to a carrier, Air Group, in the late summer of 1943. The transit across the Pacific took weeks, each day a gradual accumulation of distance from everything familiar. The vastness of the ocean defied comprehension. Day after day of empty horizon, interrupted only by the occasional glimpse of escort vessels or the distant silhouette of another carrier. The men played cards, they wrote letters, they attended briefings about Japanese aircraft recognition and enemy tactics, and they waited for the moment when theory would become practice. The carrier that received him was already blooded. Its air group had seen action in earlier operations, and the pilots who remained carried themselves with a particular economy of movement that marked men accustomed to loss. They welcomed replacements with professional courtesy, but maintained a certain distance. Attachment to new pilots was emotionally expensive. Too many had arrived with enthusiasm and departed in flag-draped caskets or simply vanished into the Pacific without ceremony. His first days aboard ship followed the rhythms of carrier life. Flight deck operations, ready room briefings, familiarization flights that allowed him to practice landings and learn the specific quirks of the aircraft he had been assigned. The Hellcat felt different from the trainers he had flown stateside. Heavier, more powerful, more demanding of attention, but also more forgiving of small errors. The senior pilots told him the aircraft would keep him alive if he let it. The trick was trusting the machine's capabilities rather than his own instincts. He listened. He asked questions when appropriate and remained silent when veterans spoke from experience. He studied the intelligence reports about Japanese fighter tactics, memorizing the recognition features of different Zero variants and the performance characteristics that defined their threat envelope. He practiced his gunnery, firing at towed targets until his scores reached acceptable levels, and he waited for the mission that would determine whether all this preparation meant anything at all. The problem facing American naval aviation in the Central Pacific was not singular. It was systemic. Japanese air power had been depleted, but not destroyed. The attrition of trained pilots at Midway and during the Solomons campaign had cost the Imperial Navy irreplaceable expertise, yet the survivors remained dangerous opponents. They knew their aircraft intimately. They had developed tactics refined through years of combat in China and across the Pacific, and they defended territory with the desperation of men who understood that each island lost brought the enemy closer to the home islands. American planners faced a strategic paradox. The carriers that projected air power across the Pacific were simultaneously the most valuable and most vulnerable assets in the fleet. Losing a carrier meant losing not just the ship, but the trained air group that operated from its deck. Yet carriers had to operate within range of Japanese land-based aviation to support amphibious operations, exposing themselves to exactly the kind of massed attacks they were designed to prevent. The tactical situation was equally complex. American fighters needed to establish air superiority over target areas while also protecting the fleet from incoming strikes. This dual mission stretched available aircraft thin and forced pilots to fly multiple sorties in conditions that degraded both human and mechanical performance. Fatigue accumulated. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, and replacement pilots arrived without the experience to understand what they were facing. The Zero remained the standard against which all Pacific fighters were measured. Its reputation had been established at Pearl Harbor and reinforced through months of combat where it consistently outperformed American opponents. Early war American fighters like the F4F Wildcat and the P-40 could compete with Zeros only through superior tactics and acceptance of higher losses. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and out-accelerate anything the Americans flew in 1942. This advantage was psychological as much as mechanical. American pilots approached engagements with the knowledge that their opponents held most of the cards. The Hellcat was designed to change that equation, but changing pilot psychology took longer than changing aircraft. Replacement pilots arrived having absorbed the lessons of 1942 without the context of 1943. They had been trained to fear the Zero's maneuverability, to avoid turning fights, to use their aircraft's advantages without fully understanding what those advantages were. Some overcorrected, becoming so defensive that they missed opportunities to press attacks. Others overcorrected in the opposite direction, assuming the Hellcat's improvements meant they could ignore the Zero's remaining strengths. The institutional challenge was communication. Combat lessons existed in after-action reports, but the gap between written analysis and practical application remained wide. A pilot could read that the Hellcat's diving speed exceeded the Zero's structural limits, but until he had actually pushed his aircraft past that limit and watched a pursuing Zero fall behind or break apart, the knowledge remained abstract. This gap could only be closed through experience, and experience in aerial combat was purchased at potentially fatal cost. The air group's leadership understood this tension. They paired new pilots with veterans whenever possible, hoping that observation and example would compress the learning curve. They conducted briefings that emphasized the specific tactics proven effective against Japanese fighters. They reviewed gun camera footage from successful engagements, pointing out the moments when proper execution had turned potential defeats into victories. But they could not control what happened once aircraft launched into combat. The operational tempo in late 1943 allowed little time for gradual introduction. Carriers moved from one objective to the next, their air groups flying strikes, patrols, and defensive missions in continuous rotation. Replacement pilots were needed immediately. There was no reserve of trained aviators waiting in the wings. Every pilot who could sit in a cockpit and follow orders was a pilot who would fly combat missions. Readiness was measured in bodies, not in skill assessments. The question that haunted every commanding officer was simple and unanswerable. How many replacements would survive long enough to become veterans? The statistics from earlier campaigns were discouraging. First missions claimed a disproportionate number of pilots who simply did not yet understand the rhythm of combat. They fixated on single targets while other enemies positioned for killing shots. They failed to check their tails. They misjudged closure rates and firing solutions. They panicked or froze at precisely the moments when decisive action meant survival. Some commanders believed the solution was more training. Others argued that no, training could replicate combat and that losses among new pilots were simply the cost of generating experienced ones. This debate continued in ready rooms and flag briefings while the war pressed forward regardless of institutional uncertainty. The mission briefing occurred in the early hours of a morning that offered no particular distinction from dozens of others. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese aircraft operating from an island airfield within striking distance of the task force. The air group would launch a sweep intended to establish local air superiority before subsequent strikes hit ground targets. Standard procedure, standard objectives, standard risks. He sat in the ready room with the other pilots of his division, absorbing the details of navigation, timing, and expected opposition. The briefing officer described reconnaissance reports suggesting significant Japanese fighter activity in the target area. Enemy strength was estimated at several dozen aircraft of various types, primarily Zeros. Weather conditions appeared favorable. Cloud cover was scattered at medium altitude, with visibility generally good but variable. His section leader was a lieutenant with 2 previous combat engagements, not a veteran by the standards of pilots who had survived Guadalcanal, but experienced enough to have seen Zeros in combat and returned to describe the encounter. The lieutenant's briefing to his wingman was practical rather than inspirational. Stay together. Maintain visual contact. If separated, climb and head for the rendezvous point. Do not pursue damaged aircraft into clouds. Do not get fixated on a single target to the exclusion of situational awareness. The walk to the flight deck carried the particular tension that preceded every launch. Aircraft handlers moved with practiced efficiency, positioning fighters for the deck run that would send them into the air. The Hellcats sat in rows, their engines already warming, their propellers throwing arcs of exhaust into the pre-dawn darkness. Pilots climbed into cockpits, accepted assistance with harnesses and connections, and began the pre-flight routines that had become automatic through repetition. He felt the carrier turn into the wind, the vibration of the deck changing as the ship accelerated to provide additional lift for the launching aircraft. The flight deck officer's signals were precise. He watched the pilots ahead of him launch, each aircraft dropping slightly below the bow before climbing away into the darkness. Then it was his turn. Throttle forward. Brakes released. The rush of acceleration compressed him into his seat as the Hellcat gathered speed and lifted from the deck. The climb to altitude took the formation through layers of darkness into the first light of morning. The Pacific stretched beneath them, featureless except for the whitecaps that indicated wind direction. Radio silence held as the aircraft sorted themselves into proper positions. His section leader's Hellcat was a shape against the brightening sky, its position fixed in his peripheral vision as he maintained station. The flight to the target area consumed time measured differently than time on the ground. Fuel consumption, engine, temperatures, the gradual emergence of terrain on the horizon. He checked his instruments in regular patterns, confirming altitude, heading, airspeed. The Hellcat flew steadily, its engine producing a constant vibration that became background noise rather than active sensation. Contact came as voices breaking radio silence. Aircraft reported ahead, multiple bogies at various altitudes. The formation began adjusting, divisions separating to cover different engagement zones. His section leader waggled wings, the signal to tighten formation and prepare for contact. He moved closer, reducing the interval between their aircraft while scanning the sky ahead. The first visual contact was a smear against the clouds, then another. Then a cluster of shapes that resolved into aircraft as distance collapsed. The Japanese fighters were already climbing to meet them, their formations looser than American doctrine prescribed, but their intent unmistakable. The engagement would happen within minutes. His section leader began a climbing turn that would position them above a group of approaching Japanese aircraft. The maneuver followed established tactics, seeking altitude advantage before committing to attack. He followed, matching the turn, watching the artificial horizon and the leader's aircraft with divided attention. The sky seemed to expand around them, filling with aircraft that appeared and disappeared against the scattered clouds. Then his leader's aircraft shuddered, smoke trailed from the engine cowling. The Hellcat fell away from the formation, its trajectory the unmistakable signature of mechanical failure or combat damage. He had not seen the attack. He had not seen any enemy aircraft close enough to fire. But his section leader was going down, and he was suddenly alone. The training manuals prescribed specific responses to separation. Climb, head for the rendezvous, do not engage alone. But the manuals had been written by men who were not surrounded by enemy aircraft, with no friendly support in sight. He counted at least 10 Japanese fighters in his immediate vicinity. Some were engaged with other American aircraft in swirling combats that defied tracking. Others were climbing toward him. The first zero came from his 4 o'clock, closing at a rate that suggested the pilot expected an easy kill. A lone American fighter separated from its formation was precisely the target Japanese tactics sought. He saw the tracers arc past his canopy before he consciously registered the attack. Instinct took over. He pushed the stick forward and rolled, trading altitude for speed in a maneuver that carried him below and away from the attacker's gun solution. The dive compressed the world into tunnel vision. Airspeed indicator climbing, altimeter unwinding, the controls growing heavy as aerodynamic forces increased. He pulled out at an altitude that left little margin for error, the gray-green Pacific close enough to see individual wave patterns. The zero that had attacked him was no longer visible. Whether it had followed the dive or broken off, he could not determine. He began climbing again, the Hellcat's engine responding to full throttle with a reassuring surge of power. The scattered cloud layer was 3,000 feet above. It represented concealment, but also disorientation. Entering clouds alone meant trusting instruments while surrendering visual awareness of threats. Yet staying in clear air meant remaining visible to every Japanese pilot in the area. More aircraft appeared around him. The swirling nature of air combat meant that positions changed constantly, that threats emerged and vanished with the rhythm of individual maneuvers. He saw a Hellcat pursuing a zero in a diving attack. He saw 2 Japanese fighters bracketing another American aircraft. He saw shapes that might have been friendly or hostile, their identities uncertain at the distances involved. A second attack came from above and behind, the classic bounce, using altitude advantage to build speed and close rapidly before the target could react. He caught the shadow crossing his canopy and broke hard right, pulling into a turn that pressed him against his harness. The Hellcat responded with the stability its designers had intended. It did not snap or shudder. It simply turned, holding together through G-forces that would have challenged lighter airframes. The pursuing Zero overshot, its pilot apparently expecting the American fighter to continue its previous heading. The geometry of aerial combat was unforgiving. A target that moved unpredictably created firing solutions that required adjustment, and adjustment required time. In the seconds it took the Japanese pilot to recognize the brake and respond, the relative positions had changed entirely. He found himself behind the Zero for a brief moment, close enough to see details of the aircraft's construction. The temptation to fire was immediate, but his angle was wrong, the deflection excessive, and his airspeed still high from the defensive brake. He held fire, watching the Japanese aircraft pull away rather than wasting ammunition on a shot unlikely to connect. The engagement had consumed perhaps 30 seconds. He was sweating despite the altitude. His breathing came in rapid, shallow pulls against the oxygen mask. The radio produced fragments of transmissions from other pilots, their voices clipped and urgent. Someone called out a warning. Someone else reported a kill. The overall tactical picture remained incomprehensible. He climbed toward the cloud layer, seeking the concealment it offered while attempting to regain orientation. The scattered cumulus provided intermittent cover, columns of white against the blue that could hide an aircraft for seconds at a time. He entered a cloud bank and felt the sudden isolation of instrument flight. The Hellcat bounced in the turbulence. Moisture streaked across his canopy. The world outside became uniform gray. He emerged on the other side to find the sky reorganized in his absence. Japanese aircraft were still visible, but their positions had shifted. The American formations had scattered further, individual engagements replacing coordinated tactics. He identified what appeared to be 2 or 3 Hellcats engaged with a larger number of Japanese fighters. The mathematics were unfavorable. The situation demanded decision. He could attempt to rejoin friendly aircraft, adding his firepower to an existing engagement. He could continue climbing, seeking altitude advantage for another slashing attack. Or he could use the clouds to disengage entirely, heading for the rendezvous point as doctrine prescribed. Before he could choose, the choice was made for him. At least 4 Zeros were climbing toward his position. They had spotted him emerging from the clouds and were converging from different angles. This was the coordinated attack that Japanese pilots excelled at, using superior numbers to create crossfire situations that no amount of defensive flying could escape. He dove again, using the Hellcat's superior diving acceleration to open distance. The Japanese aircraft followed, their trajectories creating an expanding pattern behind him. They were boxing him in, cutting off escape routes while maintaining coordinated pressure. These were not inexperienced pilots. They were hunters who had done this before. The cloud layer offered his only option. He pulled up hard, trading the speed from his dive for altitude, climbing toward the scattered clouds with the throttle firewalled. The Hellcat shuddered at the transition from dive to climb, the airframe protesting the rapid load change, but it held together. 2,000 feet, 3,000. The clouds approached like sanctuary. He entered the vapor and immediately turned, changing heading within the concealment to emerge at an unexpected point. The maneuver was improvised, a desperate attempt to break the pattern his pursuers expected. He burst from the cloud bank and found the sky around him momentarily clear. The Japanese fighters were searching, their formations disrupted by his disappearance. He used the seconds to climb further, pushing into the next cloud layer, angling toward where he estimated American aircraft might have retreated. The navigation was approximate. His internal sense of direction had been compromised by the twisting combat maneuvers. But up was better than down, and concealment was better than exposure. Emerging again, he saw a sight that inverted the tactical situation. A single Zero was below him, apparently searching for targets, its pilot's attention focused elsewhere. The geometry was finally favorable. He had altitude, he had position, he had a firing solution that would not require excessive deflection. He dove, letting the Hellcat accelerate, watching the Zero grow larger in his gun sight. The Japanese pilot seemed unaware of the threat above. At effective range, he pressed the trigger. The 650 caliber machine guns produced a vibration that transmitted through the entire airframe. Tracers reached toward the Zero in a stream that seemed impossibly slow from the cockpit perspective. The Japanese aircraft reacted, too late. He saw pieces separate from the wing and fuselage. Smoke began trailing from the engine section. The Zero rolled and fell away, its trajectory the unmistakable signature of a mortally damaged aircraft. Whether the pilot survived, whether the aircraft crashed or recovered, he could not determine. The engagement had lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but the firing had revealed his position. Other Japanese aircraft had seen the tracers and were converging. The brief advantage of surprise had been spent. He was again a target, again alone, again facing multiple opponents who knew exactly where he was. He returned to the clouds, diving into the concealment with the desperation of a man who understood his luck could not hold indefinitely. The maneuver repeated. Enter the clouds, turn unpredictably, emerge at a new position, use whatever seconds of confusion the disappearance created to assess, decide, act. The pattern continued through what felt like hours but was measured in minutes. Each emergence from the clouds brought new configurations of threat. Sometimes Japanese aircraft were distant, searching. Sometimes they were close, already maneuvering to attack. He fired again on 2 occasions, his rounds potentially connecting with targets he could not observe through completion. He took fire in return, hearing impacts against his airframe that indicated hits he would need to assess later. The radio produced a call that cut through the chaos. Rally point heading and altitude, American aircraft were attempting to regroup, to extract from the engagement and return to the carrier. He fixed the coordinates in his mind and angled toward them, using the clouds one final time to mask his withdrawal. When he emerged and joined the ragged formation of surviving Hellcats, his fuel gauge showed margins that would require careful management. His ammunition indicators showed significant expenditure. His hands were shaking with the delayed reaction of sustained stress. But he was flying. His aircraft was responding to controls. And somewhere behind him, Japanese pilots were asking questions about the American fighter that had appeared and disappeared through their formation like a ghost. The debrief following the mission extracted what facts could be recovered from the fragmented memories of exhausted pilots. Intelligence officers asked specific questions. When did you first engage? How many enemy aircraft did you observe? What was the outcome of your firing passes? The pilots answered as accurately as they could, knowing that aerial combat produced impressions rather than certainties. His account of the engagement generated particular interest. A first-mission pilot engaging multiple enemy aircraft, surviving extended contact without wingman support, and returning with possible damage to at least one confirmed Japanese fighter, represented an outcome that defied statistical expectations. The senior pilots who reviewed his statements asked follow-up questions about specific maneuvers, about his use of the clouds, about the moments when he had chosen to fire, and the moments when he had held back. The pattern that emerged from his description illustrated something the Hellcat's designers had intended but could not guarantee. The aircraft had allowed him to survive decisions that would have been fatal in earlier fighters. His dives had reached speeds that Japanese aircraft could not match. His defensive brakes had exploited structural margins that the Zero lacked. His repeated use of cloud cover had worked because the Hellcat's instruments and stability allowed instrument flight with confidence that more demanding aircraft could not provide. He had not outflown Japanese pilots with superior skill. He had survived because his aircraft gave him options that their aircraft denied them. The distinction mattered for understanding what the engagement revealed about the changing balance of the air war. Intelligence reports from subsequent days provided fragmentary confirmation of Japanese perspective. Radio intercepts indicated confusion among Japanese pilots regarding American tactics during the engagement. Multiple references to aircraft disappearing into clouds and emerging at unexpected positions suggested that his experience was not unique. Other American pilots had apparently employed similar techniques, using the Hellcat's capabilities to disrupt Japanese coordination. The tactical implications were noted in after-action analyses that circulated among carrier air groups. The Hellcat's performance envelope allowed aggressive use of vertical maneuvering that earlier American fighters could not have sustained. Pilots could dive to escape, climb to attack, and transition between these regimes with confidence that the airframe would tolerate the stress. This changed the fundamental geometry of engagements, reducing Japanese advantages in turning combat by making turning combat increasingly irrelevant. The training updates that followed emphasized these capabilities. New pilots arriving in the theater received briefings that specifically addressed the Hellcat's diving performance, its structural limits, and the tactical possibilities these characteristics created. Gun camera footage from successful engagements illustrated proper technique. And veteran pilots who had survived similar experiences became sources of practical wisdom that supplemented official doctrine. The statistical evidence accumulated over subsequent months painted a picture of transformation. Kill ratios in Hellcat engagements consistently exceeded those achieved by earlier fighters. Loss rates among replacement pilots, while still significant, declined as tactical knowledge improved and aircraft capabilities became better understood. The air war over the Central Pacific was shifting toward American dominance in ways that aggregate statistics captured better than individual stories. His subsequent missions followed patterns established during that first chaotic engagement. He learned to trust the aircraft. He learned to use clouds and altitude changes as tactical tools rather than mere survival mechanisms. He developed the situational awareness that separated survivors from statistics, the ability to track multiple threats while managing the mechanical demands of flight. He became, gradually, one of the veterans who greeted new arrivals with professional courtesy and carefully maintained distance. The carrier air group's operations continued through the island-hopping campaign that characterized Pacific strategy. Targets changed. Missions varied. The Japanese opposition shifted in composition as attrition consumed their experienced pilots and replacement quality declined. Each engagement provided new data points for the evolving understanding of what the Hellcat represented. By early 1944, the transformation was undeniable. American carrier aviation had achieved the air superiority that strategic planners had sought since Pearl Harbor. The combination of superior aircraft, improved tactics, and overwhelming numbers created conditions where Japanese air power could delay, but not prevent American advances. The question was no longer whether American forces would reach the Japanese home islands, but when and at what cost. The pilot who had vanished into clouds survived the war. He flew additional missions across the Pacific, accumulated experience that validated his first desperate engagement, and returned home to a country that struggled to comprehend what its military had accomplished. The transition from combat aviation to civilian life followed patterns familiar to millions of veterans. The skills that had meant survival over the Pacific had limited application in peacetime America. He spoke rarely about specific missions in the years that followed. The details blurred together, individual engagements becoming indistinguishable in memory from dozens of similar experiences. What remained was not narrative, but impression. The sound of the Hellcat's engine at full power, the feeling of G-forces during hard maneuvering, the particular quality of Pacific light filtering through scattered clouds. These sensory memories persisted when specific dates and locations had faded. The aircraft that had saved his life became museum pieces and memorial displays as newer technology rendered them obsolete. The Hellcat's service life ended with the war, superseded by jet aircraft that made propeller-driven fighters relics within a decade. Yet the principles the Hellcat had demonstrated remained embedded in fighter design for generations. The emphasis on pilot protection, structural integrity, and performance margins that allowed survival of tactical errors became standard expectations rather than revolutionary concepts. The tactical lessons of his generation filtered into doctrine that shaped subsequent conflicts. The emphasis on energy management, on vertical rather than horizontal maneuvering, on using aircraft capabilities rather than pilot skill to create advantages became foundational principles taught in fighter schools worldwide. Pilots, who trained decades later, flew aircraft with capabilities unimaginable in 1943. But they learned tactics whose origins traced directly to the desperate improvisations of men fighting over the Pacific. The Japanese pilots, who had asked where he went, never received satisfying answers. The war that had produced that moment of confusion ended with their nation's defeat and transformation. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air power, became a studied artifact, its strengths and weaknesses catalogued in engineering assessments that informed post-war aircraft design. The men who had flown it, those who survived, returned to lives shaped by the same dislocations that affected their American counterparts. What remained, beyond the statistics and the tactical analyses and the engineering reports, was the human dimension of what had occurred. A young man with minimal experience had entered combat expecting to follow procedures and hope for the best. He had discovered instead that survival sometimes required abandoning procedures entirely, trusting instincts developed through training he had not consciously absorbed, and making decisions at speeds that precluded conscious thought. The aircraft had given him options. The choices had been his own. The war produced countless such moments, individual experiences lost in the aggregate of historical narrative. Thousands of pilots flew first missions over the Pacific. Most survived. Many did not. The factors that determined outcomes included skill, luck, aircraft performance, enemy quality, weather conditions, and circumstances impossible to predict or control. Any attempt to extract universal lessons from individual experiences risked oversimplifying complexities that participants themselves could not fully explain. Yet certain patterns emerged from the accumulation of individual stories. The transition from vulnerability to dominance in American carrier aviation followed a trajectory that equipment alone could not explain. The men who flew those aircraft learned through experience that could not be transmitted through briefings or manuals. They discovered capabilities through Necessity developed tactics through survival and passed knowledge to successors through the imperfect medium of institutional memory. The question posed by Japanese radios that morning in 1943 echoed across decades. Where did he go? The answer involved clouds and maneuvers and aircraft performance, but it also involved something less tangible: the capacity of ordinary individuals to perform extraordinarily under pressure, the accumulation of small advantages into decisive outcomes, the transformation of mechanical capabilities into human survival. He never considered himself remarkable. The veterans of his generation rarely did. They had done what circumstances required, survived through combinations of skill and fortune they could not reliably distinguish, and returned to lives that gradually buried the intensity of wartime experience beneath layers of peacetime routine. The wars they fought became history, then memory, then stories told to grandchildren who could not fully imagine the world their grandparents had inhabited. What endures beyond individual memory is the recognition that pivotal moments often occur without recognition of their significance. A pilot fighting for survival does not think about historical consequences. He thinks about the next second, the next maneuver, the next threat. The meaning comes later, assembled from fragments by historians seeking patterns in chaos. Those scattered clouds over the Pacific held no significance until a desperate pilot used them for survival. Then they became part of the story of how American air power won the war. The lesson is not that courage or skill determined outcomes. The lesson is simpler and more profound. Sometimes you survive by disappearing, and sometimes vanishing at the right moment is the most consequential thing you can do.